We're going to have libations by Confu priest, Ajua Benign.
Well, first, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening. I'm a Confu Dr. Ajua Tano McMillan, and I will be pouring a libation. I'm a priestess in the Akan spiritual tradition. And so I will start out the libation or prayer in the traditional Akan way. And then I will combine it with the libation format that we are familiar with here in the United States, where I will ask you to share the names of benevolent, wonderful ancestors that we want to call into space this evening. All right, and so you can just kind of take a moment as I go through the libation. You could affirm with whatever affirmation word that you are comfortable with. In the Akan tradition, we may say Sa or Ya. You may have heard in other traditions Ashe. You may say Amen. You may say Yebo. You can, whatever comes to you to affirm what's being said. All right. Ago. Twitter Panya, Satian, Sa, the Vanessa Manfos, the Vanessa, Ta, Kora, Sa, Hakan Field, Sa, the Kosi, Sa, Takwa Joe, Sa, the Kofi, and Sa, Amwa, Sa, Baba, and Social and the Kofi, Sa, Nana Moati, and Sa, all Tano Baka, one of you call you all, and Sa, Namo Penny, Sa, Ola Risha, and Sa, the Loa, and Sa, and Sa. All the divinities of the Most High God on Yame and Sa, all the divine and Samanfo ancestors, we call you in Sa. We are here tonight to launch the book of Dr. Nubia Kai, the book titled A River of Prophecy. We ask, Nana, that you bless this book launch, that you bless the sales of the book, that you bless the understanding by those who read the book, that the comprehension that was intended and the learning that was intended, that it be given, Nana. We ask, Nana, that you bless all those who have gathered here tonight. We ask that you bless Dr. Nubia Kai as she present her work, that she may present it as she intended and that it may be well received. We call right now the names of her ancestors, her benevolent ancestors, to be here with her. Ashil, keep calling them, and we ask that those who are gathered here to call the names of their divine benevolent ancestors, those of the family, those of the community, those of our people, those benevolent great warrior writers, the great warrior scholars, the great cultural anthropologists, the great spiritualists, the great fighters for our people, those who keep us going, those who are the reason that we are here today. We call upon their names. We call upon their names. We acknowledge your spirit. We know that you are still here. You are still with us. We know that you are still guiding us and keeping us. We call and acknowledge you. We call and acknowledge your great energy. We ask that you accept this drink. We ask that you accept this great drink, that you accept our energy, that it empowers you in what you're doing, and empowers us in what we are doing here. We make this prayer to the Most High Yahweh. May the prayers be received. May the prayers deep in our hearts be received. Bless the energy here, bless us. Nana teach na maji na mahoya na nana moro asi amenyo. Yes yo.
Thank you very much, Akomfo Adwa, Asante Sana, and thank you all for coming out on this weekday. I know a lot of you have to go to work tomorrow, so I appreciate you coming out, supporting this book launch, particularly on this day, May 1st, which is International Workers' Day. And so I would like to dedicate this book launch to International Workers' Day, to workers everywhere. And also to our ancestors, our great ancestors, Asar and Aset. And I'm dedicating it to them in particular because I know there have been a lot of eminent scholars who have been saying that they are fictional characters. And in fact, when I first heard it, I felt like I was being kicked in my stomach. Because to me, it's like saying Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King don't exist, that they're fictional, or Malcolm X and Betty Shabazz are fictional. So I kind of felt an urgency to write this book because I know that it's like we have been inundated with so much disinformation in the educational system, as we know. And many of us who, who come to Sankofa are conscious enough to know, and we've corrected a lot of the errors. We know a lot of the history was false and we've corrected it. But there's still a tremendous amount of history concerning Africa that is still, I just say, is incorrect. And so when I wrote this book, and really I started it back in the 1980s, and this is actually an essay that I had presented back in 1992 at an International Women's Conference in Nigeria. It's an introduction to a larger work, and that larger work is maybe 300-400 pages into it. But I know it would take 2 or 3 more years to complete. And again, like I say, I kind of felt an urgency to do this book, because a lot of the misconceptions we have about African history and African historiography and African identity, I think has served to help it to kind of break us, keep us divided as a people. And it's almost destroyed the Black freedom movement and the Muslim community, and even some of the, as you could say, cultural other aspects, other groups in the cultural communities, spiritual traditions within the cultural community. So what I wanted to do was present the African story, the story that's coming from traditional African sources, not the sources that I guess some of the European scholars come and they pick and choose what they want. But they're still going to move it where this is their legacy. They still pick and choose what they want. So I was particularly interested in the way in which the genealogy has been extricated from African history, because in African historiography, genealogy is very, very important. It's almost central to the history. And if you take the genealogy out, essentially what you're taking away is the identity of the people, because that's telling you who your mother is, your father, your grandfather, and so on. That has been totally erased from the history. And I just want to read the preface to so you can get a sense of what it is I'm trying to do here. This essay is an introduction and appeal to African and African diaspora scholars to incorporate more traditional African historical methodologies and narratives into a construction of a sacred history. Traditional African history, which differs substantially from Western historical constructs, is generally ignored and dismissed by Western educated scholars, both Black and white. African historical records and genealogies consistently affirm a Cushitic, Kemetic, Hebrew, Canaanite, and Afro-Arab identity and line of descent that positions African people as the founders and organizers of the ancient Kemetic and the Judeo-Christian Islamic religious traditions. These spiritual traditions are linked in a moral and philosophical continuum that flows like a river of prophecy, each tributary leading to a new social and cultural revolution. The African spiritual heritage has been appropriated and falsely claimed as a Euro-Western heritage, and with their hegemonic power over the world, they've been able to construct and enforce an erroneous world history that is universally believed in the modern world. At the same time, traditional indigenous histories have been deliberately suppressed or destroyed by European colonizers on a global scale. European scholars of African history have heard the numerous traditional accounts of African ethnicities' origins from Ethiopia, Egypt, Kemet, which is known as Kemet, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Palestine, Akkad, Canaan, Mesopotamia, Sumer, Persia, and other nations called the Old Lands. Without any evidence, they flatly refute these accounts, then proceed to make up an origin for each ethnic group that appeases their intellectual appetite to primitivize and pathologize everything African. The problem is, Western educated Black scholars tend to believe this racist scholarship over their own traditional accounts of history, creating a ball of confusion in Black intellectual thought over the question of origins and identity. The purpose of this text is to present the little-known traditional histories and meticulously recorded written and oral genealogies that accompany these narratives. I first began my research in 1987 when I interviewed Jelly Siddiqui Diabate, a famous griot jelly from Mali. You may have heard of him. He was the father of Tumani Diabate, who passed away a few years ago. Fascinated by the history and genealogies that he shared with me, griots, known as the Jellies in Mandinka language, have multiple roles as historians, genealogists, artists, and cultural and social anthropologists, diplomats, political and judicial advisors, mediators, and officiators of rites of passage ceremonies. For nearly 40 years, I have interviewed dozens of griots and scholars of griots on the Ghana, Mali, and Songhai empires and found that they have a tremendous knowledge of the histories of ancient Egypt, Nubia, North Africa, and the Middle East, the rise of Christianity, Islam, and all these traditions because they are descendants of those people. A lot of things that you're not going to find in the temples when they're archaeological evidence, there's a lot more that's just in the narratives of the jellies. The Soninke jellies who came, all of them came from Kemet, by the way, according to their own histories. For example, in discussing the origins of the warlock, for example, this is how I was doing the research, of the origins of warlock of Senegal, right? Very artistic, creative people. I would ask, what ethnic group did the warlock descend from? Before you were warlock, what were you, right? The jellies answered they came from the Serer. Who did the Serer descend from? The Serer descended from the Soninke. The Soninke descended from the Sonim of Nubia. Now, over and over, the origins of ethnic groups in North, West, Central, East, and Southern Africa are traced back to the Nile Valley civilizations, the Levant, Mesopotamia, because people moved from the Nile Valley civilization, they tended to move east first in large numbers and then move back. So this is where you get that pattern. The Levant, Mesopotamia, and Saudi Arabia, along with detailed narratives of their sacred histories. From these studies, it became clear that what we are calling major Western religions are really the major African religions whose original revelations precipitated the political and social revolutions that changed the course of African and world history. History, why am I calling it a sacred history? Because history in African cultures, in Asian cultures, and all the indigenous cultures is considered a sacred text, in that it provides you the story, the human story. And in that human story, you can see the consequences of actions on this side, the right side, and the consequences of actions on this side. Therefore, it's providing you with directions on how to live the best way to live. The best way to live a most healthy, happy, spiritually fulfilling, psychologically and materially fulfilling life. This is what history provides for us. Also, because life is sacred, nature, animals, plants, everything is sacred. The story of the human being, the story of the human family is also sacred. Therefore, all these histories were considered sacred, and particularly those histories that were told through myth or through the mythic narratives. Now, there's two major things that I try and get to in this book that are, again, it's very different. We have something very different in the Euro-Western historiography. One is the use of myth and the understanding of myth as the highest expression of reality and truth that can be expressed within the limits of language. This is how African people see myth. And when I'm speaking of myth, I'm not speaking of it in the connotative sense, because it has come down to us merely as, oh, that's something false, that's a lie, something totally untrue. When the paradox is that in these cultures that I'm speaking of, again, these ancient cultures, all the Asian cultures, again, Asians, when I say Asian, I'm talking about Western Asia or the Middle East, which again, essentially African, the same people in the Nile valleys, the Cushitic Kemetic people are living in all those areas, including India. Remember, India was once called Eastern Ethiopia because it was inhabited by the same Cushitic people. So, one of the things I'm trying to also do is impress on people that these narratives are not fabricated. It's the same thing as if you go in the Bible and you see people with all the names of the people in the Bible. You don't go in there and say, oh, that's not true, that's nonsense. But this is what's done in Africa. Because people will have books, and they will have like a whole book with their genealogies, okay? The names of their families, and sometimes those families, even though they will condense it, it might go back 300 years or 400 years or 1,000 years, right? But they go back and they have these genealogies and they guard them. Also they are guarded orally, because the advantage of guarding it orally is that when conquerors or colonizers, enemies come to your country, the first thing they want to do is they destroy your books. They destroy your history, right? They even take the scholars out so they can't continue to write. But when it's recalled orally, right, that means they would have to kill all the people, all of the jellies, in order to destroy the history. So it is very important that people memorize history. And I also want to mention that the tradition that the Mandinka inherited, that the Soninke inherited, comes from Sonin. And Sonin, as I said, was people of Soninke, meaning Aswan. That was Aswan. People of Sonin. So the people of Sonin brought the tradition from Kemet to West Africa. And then the Mandinka inherited it from the Soninke. And one of the things that they talked about in this written historiography, the lowest level of knowledge was that of the scribe. That was the lowest level, because anybody can read and write, right? But to memorize the history, that was considered far superior to just being able to write it down. Right? And so it was encouraged. And this is one of the things that gets to me, because they consistently try to undermine the griot and the knowledge of the griot and the memories of the griot, because what they can memorize is phenomenal. I'm talking about stuff that would fill a library, that would fill a room this big. And so when they say we use 10% of our brain, you believe it when you see some of the jellies and what they're able to remember. But again, because it's so fascinating, they try and undermine it and do not consider any of the history coming from the jellies as real history, as true history. Thus, they're relegated as storytellers. But getting into this area, going back into myth. Myth, again, is, I had a thing that I talked about the function of myth, because there are people who try to understand myth as stories that contain elements of truth, all right? But that's still relegating myth to fiction. And there's a difference between stories, creative stories that have elements of truth in it, and the highest expression of truth. There is a difference. When we're talking about myth, we're talking about the language of the soul, the language of collective memory. And I had a PowerPoint about that, but I'm just going to kind of read from here what I had on the PowerPoint, because it's like switching up too much. The essential character of our personal and social lives are shaped by myth, or it is by the power of particular myths which determine, by way of determining our fundamental presuppositions, the way we shape our cultural, social, political, and economic lives. We do nothing of significance which is not informed by myth in the fundamental way, and the more significant our act, the more this is true. It is the symbols within the context of myth which give rise to all thought. The archetypal symbols give rise to all thought. So they're saying something. They're looking at mythology on a very scientific level. And I wanted to also add that in ancient Kemet, a lot of their sciences are derived from mythology. It's hard to explain this because a lot of it, again, is told in this symbolic, metaphorical, maybe allegorical language. And sometimes you have to be an initiate. You have to be initiated in order to understand the mythology. But when they came up with this knowledge, the knowledge of the sciences and the arts, it was through, they call it think tanks. They were like meditation centers, right? Centers where people meditate on the unity and the oneness of God. That's all that they did. It was a mystical tradition. So there's a time between mysticism and mythology. But again, our knowledge, the sciences and the arts came down from this mythology and mystical revelation. And so when I talk about this river of prophecy, I'm talking about the covenant that comes down, right? And then, again, this is tied to our history. What Cornell West calls the Black Messianic tradition, starting from Noah, who is also conflated as Asar, and we'll get to that. That's why I'm saying these are very real people. It started with Asar, and it continues like a sort of relay race, right? If you think of a marathon race, and they're all trying to get to the end, one prophet comes and takes it to the next stage. Then he hands it to the next relay runner. Then the other one comes and takes it to the next relay runner, and then to the next one. And how it's termed, again, is told in our text, because again, all of the sacred texts are our texts. The Bible, we think of the Bible as something the Europeans know. These were the Christianity, and particularly Christianity and Islam were actually black anti-colonial movements against Roman and Byzantine imperialism. That's how they developed. with the Hebrew, and a lot of people think because they've been so degraded in Western, Euro-Western history, people don't think of them in a good way, whether you think of them as black or white. But what I want to say about the Hebrews is that in the ancient African world, they were looked down on at all. In fact, they were looked on as kind of very, is almost elitist because they were very old. They were respected in the black world. And also, let me say that the Hebrews are a branch of the Egyptians. I know I'm jumping around a lot. When I did these questions and asked the people where did they come from and where did their origins go back to, and they always went back to some Nile Valley civilization, or in the case of the Bantu-speaking peoples were Hebrews who had migrated from the time the breakup of the north and southern kingdoms. We had this migration back into Africa, and it was mostly, again, Bantu-speaking people all going through East Africa and all through Central Africa. Then you had movements back through North Africa of the Hebrews, right? And you had a lot of Afro-Arab lineages. In other words, for the main 5 people that I trace all these people back to, regardless, and I have it in the index, where you see, like the Yadowa, the Akan, the Bemeleke, the Wolof, the Mandinka, all of those people, where they go back to, and they all go back to mainly 5 different groups, but all those groups are still Nile Valley. Sun Ra used to say, we're all Egyptian. And when you look at the genealogy, that is what it comes back to, right? So, Ethiopian, and we used to just simply be called Ethiopian, right? Egyptian, and I'm saying Nubian, Egyptian, they're all kind of the same trunk of the tree. In fact, the way I look at it, Ethiopia is like the mother principle, the feminine principle, Nubia, the active principle, where you get the development of the sciences and the arts, and then Kemet is the child. And from that child, you have the major branch, which were the Hebrew Israelites coming from the patriarch Ibrahim, who was considered a prophet and was highly regarded in the world at that time. Ibrahim, or Abraham, was Sumerian. Remember the Sumerian black-headed people? We're talking about all black people. We're talking about the time when the Europeans hadn't even intervened. We talk about Sumer, the Sumerian. And then they married with Canaanite, the Canaanite people, and they go into Kemet as an extended family, maybe 100, 200 people. Now they're intermarrying with the people of Kemet. So when they come out of Kemet, 75% of them are Hebrew, Egyptian. The Hebrews are actually a branch of the Egyptians, right? In Rudolph Windsor's book, From Babylon to Timbuktu, is documented, 75% of them. And you will hear about this family called the family of Amram. The family of Amram, which is the family of Mary, Joseph, Jesus, Solomon, all of them. The family of Amram is this Egyptian Hebrew family. The other groups also, the Afro-Arab and the Canaanite. The Canaanite, remember I think in the story of Winterby, Canaanite said, we are your cousins, right? Cousins of Kemet. So they're also coming from Noah, right? The Canaanites, the Afro-Arabs are just descendants of Ethiopians and Nubians. The ones in Yemen are directly related to the Ethiopians. In other words, without the Abrahamic line. You have those. And a lot of people, for example, the Tuareg, the Lamtunas, the Sahajin, who used to live in Mauritania when Mauritania was in Libya. Now you see it's over in the area of Senegal, in Mauritania on the Atlantic coast. But they were up where Libya is before, because the same people moved and then they take the name of the country with them. Everybody calls them Arab or Berber, now, given they're all black. But they're not either one. See, they say they're from Yemen, but they're Ethiopian. They were Sabian, they just moved, because you see where Ethiopia and Yemen are connected. It's just 20 miles distant. You can almost walk between the two. So that's where their origin is. That was also the origin of Hannibal. A lot of origins are in that Yemen period, a lot of ethnic groups, including their Yoruba. But I have all of that in here, again, according to where they came from. So if we talk about the origin or what is African religion, and I don't know how you would define it, but I would define religion that is revealed or it started by African people or originates with African people, that is organized by African people, and disseminated or promulgated by African people. And in the case of all the religions that I mentioned, the Hebrew, and particularly Christianity and Islam, because it's not connected to any ethnic group. This was Pan-African, all right, or pan-global. Like Prophet Muhammad said, this is for the blacks and the reds. And it was clear in the works of Jahiz that the blacks were Arabs, Indians, Ethiopians. He mentioned the people who were blacks. And I guess the reds were those in the Far East. That's who it was brought forth. Jesus, as you know from the Black Christian nationalists, that was for the Hebrews, the lost children of Israel who had already started this dispensation back into Africa. Remember, he said this is not for the Gentiles. And the Gentiles, that is the thing that they called Europeans at the time. Just like during the Islamic period, they called Europeans kafirs, those who cover the truth. Yeah. So these, again, traditions, and again, when I was interviewing the griots of the Soninke people who are called Gesirs, they told me that they came from Sonin, which was Aswan, and the word meant Soninke, people of Aswan, in the 1st century, and that when they came, they were Christians. Now, when he first told me that, I kind of, didn't really like, because I never heard of it. And I was not even able to use it in my dissertation because nobody ever heard of that. But then I started reading about it. And I started reading about it from very reliable sources. His name, Ibn Umar Ibn Abu Bakr al-Jahiz. Al-Jahiz is not normally known as that. He's called the father of Arabic letters. Ethiopian man from Baghdad living around the 9th century. He wrote about it. Again, he's considered a very reliable source that the Soninke in the Empire of Ghana, or Ouagadougou, was also called Ouagadougou, was Christian. Up until 1076, when the Almoravids conquered Ouagadougou, or conquered Ghana. And that was only a short time, because then they went back up to Spain. The Taifas had asked them to come out to Spain because the Visigoths were taking more land. So Yusuf ibn Tafsin, he's another very famous heroic guy. He goes to and builds Marrakesh and then goes into Morocco, into Spain. Right. So they did not conquer very long. But Ghana, they also told me that the sphere of influence of ancient Ghana, or Ouagadougou, stretched from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Nile Valley, their sphere of influence. So, again, in the history that we learn, they have Ghana and this area of Mauritania and Senegal, but they don't talk about the sphere of influence. So that's like saying the British Empire was these British Isles, and that was it. The sphere of influence went all the way across the Silk and Savannah, and they had military posts across Sahel and Savannah, which prevented the Romans and Byzantines from coming in to sub-Saharan Africa. So Ghana provided a fortress from further encroachment into sub-Saharan Africa, right? Because believe me, the people living in North Africa at the time and reading about it was almost like reading about South Africa, apartheid South Africa in the Jim Crow South. They had a system very similar. For example, intermarriage was forbidden, by the way. between blacks and whites, and I learned that from the Mandinka griot, who told me about Ghana, about the people coming and why Mama Dinga had come. And he was talking about the oppression that was going on. The Byzantines and Visigoths and Romans brought the serf system, the same serf system that they had brought into Europe. They abolished slavery in Europe because they found that serfdom was more profitable, right? Just like colonization was more profitable than slavery because you don't have to pay for the overhead. So that's the kind of system that they brought into North Africa, and it was not like that before. And it was based on, they say there was no racism until the 16th century. No. Because it was based on race then. And then you can look at 1500 BC when the Aryans came into India and what that created. That was all based on color difference. Because these were both essentially black people. One was much lighter, the Aryans. They were not white. So the color thing has been going on for a long time. And now I'm going to go kind of back into the myth of Asar and Aset, because that's such an important myth that we're living with when we talk about living myths that we're living with and it still influence us today. The Asar and Aset myth, and again, yes, beautiful story, but real people. And as you know, many human beings, especially, again, famous human beings who've done great things in their country, become deified later on, right? So this is what you say with Asar and Aset, who become deified, but they are definitely understood to be real people. They're not going to the temples every day for thousands of years. The most popular, longest ceremony in Kemet for people who are fictional. For Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox, no, they're not going to celebrate that. So I just want you to be clear on that. But I do want to say something about this myth, because it kind of, in a nutshell, tells how our legacy has been taken. And it starts with Asar, who is called the God of the Perfect Black, right, in Francis Quest Wilson's book, who is very tall, very handsome, creative genius. He goes about the world teaching all of the arts, all of the sciences, mathematics, chemistry, physics, architecture, animal husbandry, architecture. And essentially, that could mean simply that as these Caribbean Pacific people started traveling around the world, they took their culture with them. They took their sciences and their arts with them. And it's very interesting also because we learned that he taught it through music and poetry. That was the main means of explicating these even high scientific problems were actually taught through music and poetry in ancient Kemet, things like mathematics. So then he comes back, Kemet, got this long travel around, and his jealous brother, who, by the way, is the deity Set. And Set becomes the same force of the Satan and Shaitan or Satan in the Judeo-Christian tradition. In the Greek tradition, he's called Zut or Zeus, the god of violence and storm. It's the same deity essentially. But Set is always represented as kind of the god of evil, or this violent force who gets what he wants through violent force and deception. And thus, he takes Asar, he gets him drunk, and then he tries to get him to lay in a casket, and then he covers him up, and then they throw the casket in the now. And it's a whole story where Isis, Aset, comes into the story. But the point is, to me, there's instruction. There is instruction in that myth. And the instruction is very clear. The Heru, the hero, and that's where the word hero comes from, Heru. The Heru, the son of Asar and Aset, are assigned to reclaim the legacy that was stolen from them. Because what Set does after he kills Asar, he steals his legacy and claims he is on the throne. He takes his heritage and his legacy, and this is essentially what's been done with everything. Okay, you can see this almost in every level of life that this is happening with us, especially in our relationships. So to me, the Asar and Aset myth is really talking about race relationships for a long, they've just been going on for a long period, even in the primordial time. So the instruction clearly is reclaim, avenge the murder, or seek justice for the murder of his father, who was viciously murdered, and to reclaim the legacy and the heritage that was stolen from him. That is the instruction to me. That is the instruction for all of us. That is our instruction. That was the instruction in the path that Harriet Tubman, Nat Turner, Malcolm X, King, Mandela, all of our great heroes have taken. And I think now more than ever, we all have to be the Heru. All of us. If you have any questions or comments, I do want to show some of the people again. This is a small presentation of the Moors. The Moors. Who are the Moors? People will ask that question. The Moors constitute the same people that you see: West Africa, Central Africa, East Africa, South Africa, Ethiopia, Egyptians, Canaanites, Hebrews, Arabs. That's basically what the Moors were in North Africa. You had Hebrews. By this time, many of the Hebrews, Christianity is on the scene. Remember, Christianity comes as a black movement. And I do talk about it more in depth here. It comes as a black movement, unifying the black people against European colonialism, Roman and Byzantine colonialism. And then the Visigoths and the Vandals come in, and they're all just as vicious. And it did serve a purpose in that they were able to, it was a cultural revolution. You could say the cultural revolution. So they're resisting all of the Roman stuff, even though they're resisting it through kind of nonviolent resistance at this point, because they didn't have the military wherewithal to fight them. But they resisted culturally, were able to make a lot of progress because, for example, they started taking all of their resources, all their economic resources, and pooling them together. And in doing that, they were able to eliminate poverty in their community. They also started doing the hospitals. They started creating hospitals within the churches. Because they were trying to spread the gospel, they also started universal education in the churches. So there were a number of things that they were able to do culturally, and really when you listen to Jesus' message, it was really closer to Garvey's message than it was to King's message, even though they were using some of the strategies that King used, okay, in the civil rights movement. In other words, they're using nonviolent resistance for which they were severely persecuted. All those people who were crucified, who were thrown into the lion's den, who were pulled into molten lead, all of them were African Christians. The first African Christians were resisting Roman, Byzantine, Visigoth, European imperialism. That's what happened to them. And then Islam continued and finished what Christianity had started and wasn't able to finish because Islam, and these are Afro-Arabs who are joining up with black Christians. By this time, the Europeans have already adopted Christianity 400 years after the Africans had already got it. And remember, Constantine had that vision that if he adopts this religion, he will take over all the Roman Catholic. So from the time the Europeans adopted it, it was always the Antichrist in terms of their behavior, because they never changed their oppression against the African Christians. Right, so they were still, it was still the same problem. even though the Europeans have adopted the religion, are claiming that, and they claimed that the covenant was given to them, remember? It went from the Jews from the Hebrews to them. They got the covenant, so they say. The people who were crucifying, throwing the folks in molten lead, right, burning them, they got the covenant. All right, yeah. I did want to show some of this, if possible.
You can do that and then question and answer.
Okay.
Okay, let's finish, but let's give her a hand for this part. And then when you're ready, there will be for question and answer, you let us know.
Sure.
Okay.
This is a picture, remember the Barbary Wars? This is the United States decided to get their army. Built their navy, right? The Barbary Wars. And this was the lead. A lot of people think the Berbers, because there's a lot of miscegenation over the last 400 or 500 years that has significantly changed the complexion of North Africa. But 500 years ago, it's pretty much all black. And as I said, there was not any, this is some AI stuff I think of. About 50, that's not that old. About a decade. That's it. Okay, that was not. I don't know.
Next slide. Next slide.
Next. Somebody handling the slide. Wow. We had it up for a minute.
Yeah, for a picture.
And with the Moors,
What?
all right, so this was Ahadi Turaji. Like they finally, built up an army because they were taking, kind of pirating travelers, American travelers and European travelers, whites, and pirating them. They couldn't pay kind of ransom. If they couldn't pay the ransom, they were enslaved. So, but they weren't afraid of, what we call it, genetic annihilation. We weren't afraid of it. So we get genetically annihilated. That's what, remember I told you about that in the piece, right? Right, but seriously though, that's how it's changed. And this is just, again, pictures of them because you have scholars that are trying to whitenize the Moors. We're trying to whitenize the Moors. These are some of the Moors of North Africa. And I would like to point out that the Moors of Spain, the ones that Isabel and Ferdinand kicked out in 1492, they were black Hebrews. The Sephardic Hebrews were black Hebrews. Maimonides and Spinoza, you seen the pictures of them? Black Hebrews that they kicked out, and a lot of them came back into Africa. Cape Verde, the Canary Islands, even Senegal. They had those Hebrews that came back into the Senegal region. As a matter of fact, Daddy Grace's churches, who know that history, they know that they're Hebrew people. He was one of those who came from Cape Verde. His ancestors were kicked out of Spain. So this is, again, some of the beautiful architecture that you see. The pictures are not that clear. Alhambra. This is in Seville, in Spain. With the next one again, I don't know what happened to the color on here. Beautiful colors in here. Just incredible, beautiful architecture. And so many inventions in almost every field. That the Moors did, that you could almost say, well, how I look at them is like an incarnation of ancient Kemet. Not only in terms of their inventions and their sciences and their arts, but even their character is described as being very dignified. They were very fashionable, very serene and calm, very careful about their words, how they use their words. So as with many things, it just reminds me clearly of again, the ancient people. And again, when you look at the spiritual tradition, really you have to look beyond the organized form of religion, because it always gets fuzzy and political and crazy. But when you look at the mystical traditions, that's where you see a continuity that is, I guess you could say, unbreakable, that just continue, starting from the ancient mystery system, continuing through the Kabbalah with the Hebrew, the Gnosis, and the Nazarene. As a matter of fact, Joseph and them were mystics, the father of Jesus. And then the Sufi tradition within Islam, you see a consistency that anybody from any of those conditions can train the other. So
Nubia.
this is a statue, again, seems the things that they would be saying in Europe.
Nubia.
Yes.
The statue that you're showing now,
Mhm.
that's one solid piece of marble. It was carved into. The black part you see of the face is a part of marble. It's all one piece. It's not pieces joined together.
Really? Okay, very interesting. Okay. These are famous paintings you could see. And none of these lights just come out like that. Okay.
It's too light in here, that's why. If they turn the lights down, then it would be, if they turn the white lights down, it would be.
Oh,
It'll be
okay,
more
is that
vivid.
what it is? Okay, because I noticed the colors look kind of, they don't look like the same color. But you can see that these are all, black folks. Yeah, these are some older pictures of playing chess. Chess was another game after the game. Also, in this book, I talk about the 9 empires, the benign black empires. It's hard to think of an empire as being benign and benevolent because we're so accustomed to the predatory, oppressive empires of the Europeans. But there is such a thing as a benign empire. It's not bad to be part of an empire. If you're a small country, a little island somewhere, if you're part of an empire, that empire can protect you. Right? That empire can help you in case of national disasters. Empire. So it'd be good to be part of an empire because where there's unity is strength. If it's a benign empire, and I'm not saying all the black empires were benign, because I'm sure they all weren't, but I do know some that were, and one of them was Ghana, right? It provided a fortress against conquest, plus Ghana was very wealthy and was able to provide for its citizens. The other was Mali. Mali, the whole reason for the formation of the Mali Empire, they abolished slavery and the slave trade in Northwest Africa, which had become rampant at that time for a number of reasons. And this is before there were any whites involved in it. But they abolished it with this beautiful, beautiful document called the Manding Charter. The Manding Charter is in here. It is something worth reading. Mali Empire was a benign empire. You read about how peaceful you could go from one end to the other. You wouldn't have to worry about getting robbed or anything. That was a benign empire. Ghana and Persia. The Persian Empire is another one. Empire by Cyrus the Great. That did a lot of phenomenal things everywhere they went in the world. They were around 500 BC. They abolished slavery and the slave trade. They abolished it throughout the Western Asia, and had they defeated the Greeks, remember I think the Battle of Marathon, had they defeated the Greeks, they would have abolished slavery in Greece, which was 50%. Yeah, they abolished Babylon. Remember, they freed the Hebrews out of Babylon. That's even in the Bible. Darius II. Not only that, they also rebuilt the temple. He freed them, restored the autonomy, restored the temple, and then when they went to get the books, because they had burned all of the books, the biblical texts were gone. But where did they go to find the most original biblical text? Ethiopia. That's where you will still find the oldest scriptures from the Islamic and the Christian scriptures in Ethiopia. And they have to hide them, just like they have to hide the Ark. Just like all of those books that they finally were able to bring out after 50 years from the University of Sankore in Timbuktu and the other universities around, they had to hide those books in wells and caves and everything because the French were taking them out. They were taking those books out and either discarding them or just keeping them. Like my sheikh, he was telling me how Usman Dan Fodio, who was the head of Mecca, that was another brother who was fighting slavery. The French took 3,000 of his books, and they're in the basement of the Sorbonne now. They're in the basement of the Sorbonne. So they will take these books. So as soon as this unrest started, they just bring these books back out. And it was a beautiful article about how they had preserved these books and had kept them for 50 years. They finally bring them out, and what happens? That unrest that was caused in Libya just set this whole thing out of balance. But those books that they brought out are worth a lot of money. They get $1 million for them, etc. So they went after them. So now they've had to hide the books again, and we don't have access. I take that back. Actually, a lot of them are down at the Library of Congress, but nobody knows how to translate them. And I talked to some of the librarians down there. They have a lot of those texts. Remember, Henry Louis Gates was able to get the Mellon Foundation to get those books from the University of St. Paul. Got grants to do it, but they're still not doing anything with it. Yeah. So, to the next, because I wanted to show a picture of. Well, you don't see this very well, but these are the Persians, the black Persians, the real Persians. Sheila Walker said they're still there. You know, the original Persians are still actually in Persia. You got to go there to see them, all right? Well, you can see Darius the Great. I think that's Darius the Great. The story. You can go to the next one. There, see the color, see the woolly hair, the color is not that good. But there's dark brown skin folks. The dark brown skin with kind of woolly hair. It look very much like when you see the murals at Persepolis, they very much look like the Egyptians, right? So this is, again, the Achaemenid dynasty of the Persian. That was the great black benevolent dynasty that I also talk about. The other was the Moors. When you look at what happened when the Moors came into North Africa and Western Asia, then in Western Asia they're called Saracens, same people. In fact, you see them called Moors and Saracens interchangeably. When the Moors and the Saracens, they got rid of that serf system that the Europeans brought in, right? They got rid of the serf system, and they started breaking up what they call those large land estates that the lords had. They started breaking up those lords' estates and redistributing the land to the people. That's why even in Spain, the Visigoth peasants preferred the Moorish rule because they were ruling, more justly. They provided them with land and things that they did not have under their own people. So they preferred their rule. Remember Stanley Lang talked about that. But it's hard to find any information on the Moors. We could go check another. Okay, these are again Moors. These are Canaanites though. The Carthaginians were Canaanites. So all of these different people, Canaanites, the Berbers, which the Canaanites are Berbers, they're also called Amazigh, that's what they call themselves, and Kabul, same people. The Greeks called them Phoenicians. But these are the Carthaginians, Canaanites, Berbers, same folk, right? And you see how they look. I remember when I lived in Senegal, people called Libo had come from Carthage. And they talked about how they came with these great big hats that looked like sailboats. And then when I was in Morocco, I think that was 2016, I saw these same folks, right? These Carthaginians with these big red hats that looked like sailboats, right? And this is how they were described when I was in Senegal, how they came from Carthage and came into Senegal in these boats. And they were some of the earliest inhabitants of Senegal around 300 BC. So it's just very interesting to see the connections. Okay, maybe you could go to the next one. Envisioning the Afro-Arab. This is the one, because again, Saudi Arabia is 85% black. 85% black. And you will never hardly see those black people. They show you the people that they brought in from Jordan and Turkey. And you always see them at the desk. You never see any people. You never see any people interacting. And they're very adroit at doing that. And people believe what they see. And all you ever see is white Jews, white Arabs. So that's what's in your brain. And I'm telling you, when I was living in Senegal in 1990, the early 90s, and people were asking me, well, where do you live in the United States? I said, I live in Washington, D.C. They said, oh, I didn't know it was black people in D.C. I said, yeah. I said, it's 80% black in D.C. I said, well, I don't ever see any people in D.C. because they had the United States Information Service. They were going down there to look at the news, to see the news. And they said, well, I've never seen any black people in D.C. And I go down there and I watch the thing. So I went down there because I was trying to get a job too. So I go down to the United States Information and I'm looking at the news and looking at D.C. and I'm looking. I see the mall, I see the Capitol, I see the White House and the monument. I don't see no black folk. No black folk. And this was in like the late 80s, early 90s. So you see how they do that?
Oh, it looks like that now.
Huh?
It looks like that now.
Right, yeah, that's a whole other story. But yeah, so that's what they do. So you have no idea who's really there. And the thing is, the people who you think are the real Arabs, and I hear this stuff all the time, they think the people in the Sudan and those black folks in Chad and stuff are the slaves. That's what they think. Well, they're the slaves of the Arabs, and they think they're the Arabs. And I hear them talking in the store sometimes. Maybe it's a brother from the Sudan. He says, I'm an Arab. And then the woman from Syria says, I'm an Arab, I'm Arab. He says, yeah, I knew you Arab, but that fool think he's Arab. But the woman from Syria is probably the one, because a lot of them came down during the Crusades when they wanted to take Jerusalem, right? And that was one of the Pope. They were fighting each other, so they figured, look, the best thing to do is get people united, give them another enemy. And that's what the whole purpose of this Pope came up with. Okay, we're gonna take Jerusalem from the Muslims. And that's another thing. Again, a lot of people that we think are white that were black, those people who fought in the Crusades, the Saracens they call them, or the Moors, because they were also just Moors, black folk. They defeat them every time except for the first one, which was total ambush. They just went through killing everybody in sight. Remember that? And then Salahuddin, you see him in the movie, Anthony Quinn played him somebody. They always have a white swarthy man playing these roles, right? This man was black, he's Egyptian. Salahuddin, one of the greatest leaders. But I'm gonna tell you, when I heard about how he even negotiated it, right? Because that's what he's famous for. They didn't do anything to persecute them. Not that they didn't hold them accountable, they just said, get going. They weren't trying to, deal with no heavy retribution or anything, and that just blew the Europeans away. But I knew that by that negotiation, that was a black man that did that. Just know certain things that we do. And it was. And because you see the name Zanj in his name, again, the genealogy will tell you who the people are. That's why genealogy is so important. So important. But I wanted to get to the family that was ruling Saudi Arabia when the British came in 1920. 1920. This is how black Saudi Arabia is. Now you remember, this is a guy from Kuwait. Remember when Bush wanted to attack? Right, and they saying right because he was the head of Kuwait. And that was just a pretext for him to go in there and take Iraq. You see this, brother? And a lot of these guys on those countries outside of Saudi Arabia, they look just like that. They're very dark, right? Okay, we go to the next one. Now this is Umar Mukhtar. Remember Lion of the Desert?
Anthony Quinn.
Yeah, Anthony Quinn played the role. Look at this guy. Yeah, Anthony Quinn played that role. Yeah, he played Hannibal. He played Hannibal before, and you heard about the controversy with Denzel. See what I'm saying about? We should be afraid of genetic annihilation. But these people from Tunis, who may be descendants of the black people in North Africa, didn't want Denzel to play the role. And he brought millions of dollars into Tunis, just like he brought millions into Pittsburgh when they did Fences. Cleaned up that whole community. He brought millions to that country. And they don't want him to play the role. They want a white man to play an Ethiopian, because Hannibal was Ethiopian from Yemen, his origin, the Tuba Kings. So anyway, that's the real Umar Mukhtar. Al-Wahhab. Now he's a guy, he's a black dude. You can't see the color that well. This kind of extreme Islamic stuff that you see. And by the way, I do talk about, again, the Christianity that Africans brought, the Islam that the Moors brought, as opposed to what happened when the Europeans took over. You see a complete change. This hijab and all this stuff was brought in by the Ottoman Turks. But 900 years later, hijab. Wahhabi started this movement, I think 18th century, of bringing hijab. And I've noticed the last 30, 40 years I've been traveling to Africa, I'm seeing sisters with their beautiful galas and all of this stuff, or they wear the thing like the told, like you see in India, you see that in Sudan and in Ethiopian places. Now they're in this hijab stuff. I'm seeing that lately. But anyway, that's Wahhabi. The Wahhabists are again the ones who are extreme, especially against women. Yes. You have a question? Mm-hmm.
How does the Pope play in history?
The Pope, the present Pope, or just the Pope? Actually, the first Pope, that's another thing. The intellectual architect of the Catholic Church, and I think we forget this, has been so just messed up, is St. Augustine. St. Augustine, he's an intellectual architect. It was black folks that started the Catholic Church. But I'm sure it's not like the way the Catholic Church is run now. And there were several popes. You know, there were 4 that were from the African continent. But then again, you had all the black people that were living in the Middle East or Western Asia. All right, like St. Gregory's, a lot of saints that were part of Syria and other places that were black. So we really don't know, but actually there were a lot of African popes before there were any white ones. Okay, but the Pope now, to me, it seems like when Europeans adopted Christianity, they didn't adopt the spiritual part of it. I mean, even morally, I guess some of the people, they really dumbed down Europe pretty bad. You know, they really, during that period, they really did. So, you know, I can't speak for the popes, the European popes. And even the African ones, I don't know a whole lot about. You know, except, again, the writings of Augustine. And all the church fathers, by the way. All of the early Christian church fathers, the one that they call saints, were African. Tertullian, Ephraim, St. Anthony, who started the monk tradition. Maurice, St. Maurice, Origen. But there was enough. Origen, all of these guys. Athanasius, Arius, for which they had the Nicene Conference over their argument, all African. So again, Europeans come in much later. And it's a funny thing because they'll start talking about, oh yeah, Barabbas was the black person. No, all the people in the biblical text were black. They'll start talking about Belial. Oh yeah, Belial was the black one. No, all of them were black. And I have the genealogies of all of the prophets in here too. You know, Prophet Muhammad, and Jesus and others. The genealogy tells you who they are, and that is what we have removed from the history and what we need to put back into it. And also pay attention to the living myths that still inform our thinking and our behavior, our living myths. Okay.
Can we hold the question, please, folks, so we can finish the slide?
Okay.
Okay.
This is the Rashidi family. This is the family that was running Saudi Arabia when the British came in as a protectorate and came under the control of Britain. That's when the British brought these white-looking guys, right, Arabs in. They do that every time. They bring them in to take control of the country, but they were resisting. So this is the Rashidi family. You can go, I think some other pictures of them. But you see how they look, right? So now, this is a sister from Beirut. Here's another one. Okay, that's again other examples of Afro-Arabs and Sudan and Saudi Arabia. Okay, you can go to the next one. Wow, there's 71 Afro-Arab. Okay. into another one. Next one. I was hoping I would see more,
Change.
more of the Rachetti family, because I had more of them, but I didn't see it there. Big difference with that. So you're getting an idea of how the again folks this again is what you will see mostly in Saudi Arabia. And I mean, I had friends who I told were there, you know, Saudi Arabia is black. They thought I was crazy. But then she had a son that lived there and went and stayed many places. All she saw was black folks. You know, all she saw was black folks. And that's who's been there. And many different ethnic groups you will see that actually trace their origin back to Saudi. But again, Saudis are Ethiopians and Nubians, right? You know. Any other questions or comments?
Okay, we're gonna go to the question now. Maritu, let's go.
Is this-
You have to. Is there an announcement or just question and answer?
Do you want? Okay.
No.
Do you
Okay, let's go. Anybody who has questions, the sister has a mic. We'll wait for the mic.
Iraq was Persian, right? The Iraq.
Iraq.
Yeah.
Iraq.
Yeah.
Iran.
Iran.
Iran, yeah.
Yeah.
You see, the territories changed so much. The Persian Empire covered a lot of that area. It probably did at one time. The empire did. Because it even took part of Egypt.
And Afghanistan, too? Persian. They have Persians there, too.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Iran and Afghanistan.
Yeah, near the Afghanistan and Iran
Yeah.
area, yeah. It was a huge empire. So yeah, it did cover, at that time, almost all of the Middle East, including parts of Kemet. And you know, and the Persians, even though I think Herodotus had things to say about the Persian rule there, but actually the Commit writers had good things to say about it because they abolished slavery. The slave trade, they were against that. And they were for maintaining people's autonomy. Okay, any other question?
Yeah, there's a question here.
Yes, thank you for this talk. It's really informative and a great introduction. I look forward to reading the book. I had a question. I noticed you had placed a lot of emphasis on like the delegitimization of like the oral accounts that inform this history and establish Aset and Asar as actual historical figures. I'm curious about what the argument is that delegitimates those primary sources that you're talking about relative to the Western sources, because it's, you know, if someone talks to someone in the Western academic sense, and it's a primary source, right? So can you speak to that a little bit more? I'm just curious about that.
I'm trying to understand your question when you say the primary source.
Well, you were talking about the oral histories and the oral traditions
Right,
from
right.
people that you've interviewed that basically give these accounting that inform what others consider as myth that you state is true. So I'm saying, how do they say that those sources are not legitimate is what my question is.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, because I guess maybe because they're not written, because they go against their thinking and the fact that they're claiming certain traditions as theirs. All right, and the jellies have another story, so the stories are conflicting, and that's another reason they would reject it. Another reason I think is out of pure envy for the fact that they can memorize so much. So they try and undermine it by saying, oh, well, they're just making up stories. You know, because usually people, you would be fascinated with a person that can, you know, has a great memory, but they're not. It's always, you know, they have to put you down for it. So I think part of it is that, and because they're so multifaceted, they do so many things, but because they do a lot of things, because if you have knowledge of the history, you have the knowledge and the wherewithal, right, to make decisions, to be a judicial advisor, to be a mediator, and so on.
I guess my question was just, I was just curious as to like from journalists go out and they interview people and there's no question about whether those sources are, like, oh, I spoke to this person, this, that, and the third. So that was just my point there. And I was just gonna say, like, recently, and I haven't done a lot of research on it, I just saw it, that Iran recently opened up a vault that proved that, like, the Hebrew Israelites were, like, black, that they've had all this stuff buried up under, like, a library in Iran. Like, it just came out, like, maybe about a month ago. So have you heard about that at all? And could you speak to that if you have?
No, I haven't heard about it. But I know that it's a lot of information about the Hebrew identity being, African, and that's something that they have always consistently tried to bury or censor or distort in some way. And Putin recently came out with pictures of Christ. Somebody has sent me that as well. It's supposed to be ancient pictures of Jesus as a black person, and then they came out and they said, oh, well, just because he's represented as black doesn't mean he's black. So, and then, there's a widespread movement in Africa now, kind of reestablishing the Hebrew identity. And I went to a conference and, some of the Ashkenazi Jews were talking about that. They said, well, no, it's just an interest in Ashkenazi Judaism type. But it's like, no, they're reclaiming an ancestry. That's really what they're doing. Because, again, all of the Bantu-speaking peoples, they're Hebrew. And then you have a lot of the Akan people. The Akan priests, they call them people of Dan. All the people that have the word Yahweh, Yahweh is a variation of Yahweh. A zombie is a variation. It's another variation. So I think and you have a lot of DNA now just establishing that. Like the Limba people of South Africa, who said they were children of Joshua. And with Joshua, when Menelik brought the Ark of the Covenant down, 10,000 of the priests from the Cohen, the priest Aaron came with them. So you had all of that dispensation, 10,000 people throughout, Southern Africa. And the Igbo people, they've already established that they have, again, DNA coming from the Jaja Udu. Yeah, did you have a question? Yes.
Hold 1 second. Okay, hold. You want to ask?
Yeah. Are the Ashkenazi Jews black or are they white?
The Ashkenazi Jews are the Jews that we see that came out of Russia.
Oh, okay.
The Ashkenazi Jews, most of the Jews that are here are Ashkenazi Jews. Now, they have a king. There was a book, Joseph Kessler did a book on the lost tribe or something.
13th tribe.
The 13th tribe, right? The 13th tribe, and that was the Ashkenazi Jewish tribe. He traces their origin back to people called the Khazars. The Khazars, and the Khazars had once been a black people. They could have been Hebrews, right? Because you had that Hebrew dispensation everywhere. But by the time they get to Russia, and the Caucasus Mountains or one part, they're white. And the way the story goes, it was around the 8th century after Christianity and Islam had been established. The people are going proselytizing, and the king or president or whoever was the head of Russia at the time said, well, you're talking Islam and Christianity, but I want to go to the roots of it, the one that came before that. Right, so he decided to adopt Judaism. And that's where the story of the 13th tribe comes from, the Ashkenazi Jews. They could actually be descendants of, but they don't appear like that, and they don't act like African Hebrews, obviously.
Okay, Nubia, I want to ask you, quickly pass it to other, but the Jalis, Fulanis, lost tribes of Ethiopia, the whole West African area, this concepts or these words overlap. And how do you delineate their overlapping? The Jellies, the Fulanis, and the lost tribes of Ethiopia. In the West African, this is from Burkina to Senegal, Gambia, all over. This is what I hear. So if you just want to untangle, if it makes sense to you. If not, there's another question for you.
Okay, and you're asking me the origin of the Fulani?
No, it's not the origin. Why is it overlapping? The Jellies are, films are even made. I know a filmmaker from Ivory Coast. His film is called Jelly.
Right.
So to me, when you were doing your research, did they overlap? Did you see them overlapping?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, again, it all coming from the Soninke, the Nubians, and they brought it to West Africa around the 1st century. This tradition we're talking about, the Mauritania Senegal region. Then the Mandinka adopted it from there. The Mandinka are famous because they were really great musicians. And so then you see the Mandinka influencing the Fulani who were in West Africa and the Wolof, because they adopted a lot of their practices, a lot of their traditions, even some of the songs and the way they played the songs. So it's still coming from the same place. And the Fulani, well, there are two different Fulani, but the black Fulani came from Kemet with the Hebrews. When the Hebrews left Kemet, the Fulani, who were called the Sumeri people or the Samosa people, left with them. They were the people that they say worshiped the cow, right? They made the golden calf. And then Pharaoh was mad at them, right, because they left with the Hebrews, so he would let them back in the country. So they ended up going to the Sinai Peninsula. The Sinai Peninsula was called Fut. And so that's where the people, the Fulani, had settled, Fut, because they were first called Futa, right? They're called Futa, Puel, Fule, Fulani, Fula, all of those names, same people, right? So that was the origin of the first Fulani. You see, they'll have the lineage names of like Ka and Ba. And then there's another iteration of the Fulani, what they call the Red Fulani. They're a little lighter, and they come from Ufa ibn Nafsi, who had conquered Tunis, the Afro-Arab who conquered Tunis, and Tajimawa, a Hebrew woman. So that's the Fulani with the name Jallo, Jackie T, Samare, you've heard those names, Bari. Those are what they call the Red Fulani, even though they're very dark, typically like most groups throughout Africa, by the way, same mama, same daddy, just like over here. That's something I found very fascinating, right? Because we think, we all these different colors because we came from Africa, all these different colors, seriously. Yeah, not to say we were, because we know what happened, right? I'm not negating that, but I had a grandmother that came here this color. So you say, it came from rape. Yeah, I know that there were ancestors from my family who were, but it doesn't necessarily mean that because my complexion, right? And different hair textures and everything. But we have this thing in our mind, the anthropologists tell us what we're supposed to look like, right? So if you have keen features, people say, you got Caucasian features. No, they have our features. You know what I mean? So, but I hope that answered. The overlapping is interesting because the Fulani called the Jellies, and they use the same kinds of tradition in Mandinka because they were influenced by them. They call it Gajwal. And the Wolof also used Gajwal. In fact, there was a movie, remember, called Gajwal.
Okay, there's another question.
Yeah.
Peace and blessings, Mama Nubia. I love your scholarship. I've known you for a while. I love your scholarship. You're always cutting edge, and that's what I like in connecting the East to the West and bringing forth, things that we don't hear every day, and then documenting it as well. So, I read your book, and I must say some of those things you introduced, my mind was grappling with it because it's like I've never heard that before. How does she justifying this? I wanted to figure some things out, so I'm happy to talk with you. Just a couple questions here. So you mentioned that the Soninke people came from Aswan, Sonin.
Sonin, yes.
Yes, and that they were Christian people when they left, and they founded the Ghana Empire. Now I was wondering, you mentioned that Al-Jahiz is one source for the Ghana Empire being a Christian empire. One, I was wondering if you had any other sources, and then two, was it just the rulership that was Christian, were the people Christian? And what to say of like the indigenous practices that we know of that aren't necessarily associated with Christianity that are associated with the Ghana Empire?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that question. The main source were the Gesirs. These are that's what they call the griots or the historians among the Soninke, the Gesirs. Also, they're called Java also. And the other source again was Al-Jahiz. The other source, and there were a lot of sources still in French, Dirtelin and Sia, Nampir Ghana. They talk about it there in length, or at least they talk about the movement from Sonin to Ghana, the region of ancient Ghana, and different things that they had to do. I'm not sure if in that book they talk about it being Christian. They're given who published, who wrote it. I doubt it. But yes, the rulers, they didn't, as far as we know, they didn't force this Christianity on the people. You know, like you had in certain countries, everybody had to be Catholic or everybody had to be Protestant. You know, it wasn't like that. You know, so people were practicing different traditions. And but you know, there was another thing. There were other monotheistic traditions, believe it or not, besides Christianity and Islam. For example, well, the Zoroastrianism was considered a monotheistic tradition of the Persians. And with these rulers, the Achaemenid dynasty, they were really much into, again, the Zoroastrianism, you know, the teachings of the prophet Zoroaster. I talk about it in the book, some of their teachings and things. So you see a lot of these movements, these renaissances, I call them, they were black revolutions, really. What happened in the Christian movement was a cultural revolution. The Islamic was a real black revolution in which they were able to actually militarily break the power of the Europeans who were there, right? Romans, Byzantine, and then also the Persians, who even came before them, were definitely revolutionary. And it was always, the thing is, it was all, our movements are always undergirded by a spiritual, moral, ethical tradition. They're undergirded by that, seems like. Just a kind of a revival of this, again, prophetic tradition. This black messianic tradition is undergirded by that. And even in miniature, right, what we see in our own experience, the oratory of King, the oratory of Malcolm, they're using the language, the kind of language that you see in biblical texts, the allegories, the metaphors, the symbolisms, right? They're using some of those same archetypes that they talked about that influence all our thought. That's why I think the power in their use of words, because they're picking up on that prophetic oratory.
Well, Mama Nubia, thank you. I'm gonna leave it with, I'm gonna say this and then give the mic to someone else. Thank you for that answer. And I'll speak with you more detail afterwards. But I wanna know the chronology of the so-called Middle East and North Africa becoming white. What is the timeline? Because, or not necessarily white, but off-white, that's what I said.
Yeah.
I mean, it's more true for me. You know, so how did we go from, you know, black to off-white? And then where did the white people come from? Are they the same people who, as the Aryans who came into India? Is the timeline the same? You know, where did these white, where did the white people come in the Middle East, in North Africa? And where did they come from and when did they come there?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. And I think it probably happened in stages, but I would say it's very recent. And from talking to people, talking to some of the scholars and historians and just some of the ordinary people in Senegal and Mauritania and in Mali, 1492. It was like the world flipped over. It flipped over, and a lot of North Africa was black. And you say 500 years ago, just like 500 years ago in the Americas. 500 years ago in the Americas, all black and white, at least 80% black from Africa. The other brown, and I believe there were Irish here as well. Certain whites were here besides the Vikings, but then the British not give Irish credit for doing something before them. And that's why you see kind of the mononymy up in Canada, very fair-skinned Native peoples. So you had a mix of all of them, but most of it was 80% that was here. In North Africa, that's when they were telling me, and even in the book, it talks about how things changed, like in the 14th century, how the status of women changed. And it's interesting that you say where they came from. In the case of the Ottoman Turks, who were really the ones that started bringing in like the hijab and this like oppression of women, and also African writers, indigenous and traditional scholars, like the scholars that wrote the Tariq al-Fatash and the Tariq al-Sudan of the Sky Empire, they talked about how these people, these whites, the Turks would come in and then challenge and deny their authenticity as the real people of Muhammad, as the real descendants of Muhammad, the real descendants of the Sahaba. They used to write about that. The Moors used to write about, look, these people, we keep sharing our knowledge with them and they're putting their names on it like they wrote it. So they would start saying, well, maybe we shouldn't share these things with them. And not to mention all the universities had been started. So with North Africa, when they start coming in again, during the Crusades, especially males kind of start coming in. But actually, most of the changes took place with women. I was telling you about the Barbary Wars. There were about 1 million white Americans, and then many from Europe, and in some cases was raiding for white women, the Moors and white women. Remember, Gerard, when we went up to that Pocahontas place, and we were talking about it in the car. When we get up to the lecture, the guy's saying the same thing. But the same thing with the Middle East, in Iraq and Iran and all those countries, yeah.
Okay.
So it came through miscegenation, because we're not afraid of being genetically annihilated, and therefore we kind of got annihilated. And there's a way to do that, because remember, the Portuguese and the Spanish had that policy in their countries, right? And it was enforced in Argentina, in Chile, which is why you don't see black people could not cohabit or marry another black person. And the purpose was to get rid of the black seed, at least phenotypically, to get rid of the black seed through miscegenation. And see, in North Africa, they were also had policies, the Ottoman Turks, because they had that policy. They had to give one of their daughters to Egypt, Sudan, right, and all those countries that they had colonized. One of the things they had to do to tribute, give us your woman. And so they would give their daughter, they had to give their daughters. And I know in the Sudan, when I'm in Sudan, there's a group called the Mahualim. And the Mahualim were a group, they were just fair-skinned black folks. They're about the blacks that you saw. And they weren't even that light, right? The Mahualim were the products of these Ottomans, Turks, and, you know, the women that the men had to give their daughters to them. So they're the products. And you had the same thing happening in Yemen, I understand too, all I heard, where they were not allowing them to marry anybody but another white person. And through 2 or 3 generations, you leash them out. You get leached out.
Okay.
So, I mean, even though they're in the minority, they can work it where, you know, yeah.
Another question.
Yes.
Here.
Hey, Mama Nubia.
Hey.
Hey, listen, I think it's interesting that you're talking about the Irish, because my family just discovered through genealogy all the Irish blood that came through our family right here in this United States. and with my last name, where it comes from. And I thought that was totally crazy when I heard it. But you just explained some things about it. But my question to you is, can you talk more about those oral histories, those orals that were around long ago, and how this current and historic and current Bible was put together, this Christian Bible, utilizing those oral histories and from the original or the spiritual traditions of our people long ago? Is there ways to tie that into this current Bible?
I understand that the Bible was, orally, was encouraged to memorize, orally, and scholars, like I said, the highest level of divinity school. The Howard Divinity School teaches that the reason why King James got that Bible translated is because the Gutenberg Bible had come out. Gutenberg, remember, had started printing, mass producing the Bible. They learned printing from the Chinese and started mass producing Bibles, and they started mass producing these Bibles with these long commentaries, long liberation theology commentaries on the evils of slavery. King James didn't like that because they had just won that war with Spain, the Spanish Armada, and they had just got the Asiento, which is what Europe was fighting for centuries, all during the slave trade. Whoever had the Asiento controlled that trade, on who was going to trade what. So that's what the wars were fought over. Then he had the Asiento, now there's Bible circulating about the evil, so he wanted to again get rid of it. So he, had his Bible translated. In fact, they said Shakespeare, Bacon, a lot of them were involved with it in the translation of it, right? And they have all these little cryptograms, hidden cryptograms in there. You can see where the tampering goes, how they turn the myth of Asar and Aset around, and they said, and you shall serve us, Japhet, which means I am Set, that you will serve Set, Ham, right? The Camites would serve Ham. They put that in there. They switched the myth around, and they did certain other things in there, in the biblical text. So it ties in. I mean, there's still a lot that you can gain from it, but there's still a lot that's been turned around. So, all I can say is, it's very hard to find an original Bible. Some say the Old Catholic Bible, the Old Jerusalem Bible, that has the books of the Apocrypha, but I'm saying that they're very, very hard to find, But a lot of us, just in the oral tradition, have a lot of knowledge, or at least when we came here initially in the 17th and 18th century. Do you know King Tut was a common name in the 18th century? King Tut. Yeah, I mean, I know the slavers weren't giving their children those names. Carter didn't go until 1920, right? And found King Tut. So you see a lot of those traditions. Our people had more knowledge of the biblical stuff than the Europeans did when we came here. As Muslims, as Hebrews, as Christians, we were Christians and Muslims. When you consider that half of Africa was Christian during that early Christian era, And then half of Africa was Muslim later. Most of the region that was Christian became Muslim during the Muslim era. We were Christians and Muslims before the Europeans adopted it, several centuries before they adopted it. That's why it is an African religion. It's a traditional African religion. You can say it's universal, but we should claim it. We are told to claim it, not disclaim it. And a lot of us totally disclaim it. When these were the traditions of our parents. That's why this stuff is in our DNA. And we have seen Christianity and Islam exhibited in our people, or at least Christianity. I haven't seen much Islam, except in Malcolm.
Any questions? So we're going to go to a book signing, and so we'll have enough time. If we'll take a few more questions. Anybody? Okay, sister.
Thank you, sister.
Thank you, sister.
Can you go into when the Moors came to North America and talk about Morocco and some of the trees that were signed recognizing America?
I hear that treaty, and I don't have the exact date, after the war, the Barbary Wars, that Morocco was one of the first countries to recognize the United States, and Tunis also was one of the first to recognize. The other question that you just asked me, you have to repeat it, the one before that you asked.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to know if you could talk about when the Moors came to North America.
Moors. Yeah, that's very good, because you know the Moors, I know that the emphasis is always in the Congo, right? But the Moors were some of the absolute first that were brought to the Americas, because the Moors were right there in Spain, right close to the Europeans, and there was actually a very lucrative trade that went on that the British ran. They were the traders, and they were trading the Moors who were still in Spain. Also, when I was teaching over at Howard, one of my students, and I've talked about them, one of my students brought me a book. Again, the book was dealing with theater, but it was talking about the Spanish Armada. You know, a lot of the Moors had helped the British fight to defeat the Spanish. And you know what they did to those Moors that helped them defeat the Spanish? Put them on a ship to America. And my student brought me that book. And I didn't have the wherewithal even to write, get all the information down. But so yeah, they came in large numbers. That's why there were so many skills that were brought to America. That's why Gilberto Freire in that book, Masters and Slaves, said the Brazilian civilization was the blossoming of African civilization in Brazil. It was all. The Moors had better literary skills and technical skills than their slavers, most of whom were illiterate. But the same is true of the United States. When you think about, because again, a lot of the early folks who came were Moors. Mama Soraya, right? The Goramonte, she was a Moor. Her ancestors, a lot of the Jamaicans, Maroons were Moors. And a lot of them, again, going into Brazil. But even here, it's that Moorish architecture that you see all down there in Louisiana, South Carolina. A lot of that Moorish ironwork and stuff. Those plantations, most of those plantations throughout the South, there's no architect's name connected to it. They came here and built that with no blueprint, nothing. The Moors and other Africans, right? But the Moors were very, very skilled. And that's why when they left Spain, that's when Spain went down. And they admit that. Yes.
I was wondering also, talking about the Moors, about the Moorish or the Moor women.
Oh, yes.
Okay, that's one. And the other thing, I was wondering about the priests in terms of were they married or were they just dedicated to their position, or how did that work?
The priests in Christianity, you mean, the monk tradition?
Right, because we talk about the Catholic priests and, they vowed that they wouldn't marry, and other priests that are that devote themselves to going up into the mountains and being celibate, so I was just wondering about that too.
Yeah, okay. Now the
Which
first
women
question,
first?
the first question was the woman. Yeah, that was again one of the fascinating things about the Moorish woman and about Islam and their position on women. Because as horrible as it looks now with the Taliban type people, it was the total opposite. Islam really exalted women. And I would say Christianity did too, because Christian women very early on played a very, very important role in Christianity. But in Islam, they were exalted. The mystic writers, the Sufi, compared them to Allah. The woman was the epiphany of God. You know, you had all these writers writing about all this romantic love stuff and bending the knee, getting on the knee and proposing and singing the troubadour songs and writing poetry and songs for the wall that came from the Moors. And women did everything. They did everything that the men did. They were surgeons, they were doctors, they were professors. The first university at the University of Caroline in Fez was started by 2 African Muslim women. They were educators, they were poets, they were artists, they were cartographers. They did everything the men did, and they did a lot. Chemists, again, this hijab and all that crap, no. They were beautiful, they had these beautiful clothes, and they used to have dresses and hats to match the clothing. They didn't, all of that stuff, no, none of that stuff. That comes in several centuries later, and people think that's the stuff that, you know, that's the real thing, this Taliban stuff. It's a total perversion of Islam, complete perversion. Women were very, very free. Yeah, very, very free. Had a lot of, yeah. So, the other question, yeah, the priest. Because see, the priest, from what I understand, that was not always the tradition, where the priests were allowed to marry. But, and I think it was, in Spain, this was much later when it had become very much a part of the European tradition. They could marry and they could have women. And I understand they had so many women and so many babies around the countryside. It was the priest babies. The priest babies. That's when they said, okay, we're gonna say you gotta be celibate from now on. Yeah, they made them, they put that on them. They said, all right, you're gonna have to stop this. Just stop it all. So I hear that's what happened. I don't know what year that it came in, but that was not always the case. It was not always a thing where the priest could marry. And they had plenty of sex. And even now, even though they can't have sex, remember Swami Krishna Pai? He was talking about how in all the churches and stuff, they have all this porno and they let monks stuff. And they're monk stuff, so I guess they, do it that way. But yeah, so that's what happened. Now with Saint Anthony, the monk tradition in Christianity, I don't know. I'm curious to know how that went. I don't know if it was a thing of abstinence or not. I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Thank you for the presentation.
Okay.
Thank you. Before we go any further, I wanted to invite co-owner and filmmaker Sharika Nagarima to the stage. Say something.
All right, just putting my things down. Are we sure there are no more questions? I think that Nubia always excites us with her research if it's the Maroons and her novel on the Maroons. I hope you guys have picked it up.
I did bring a few with me.
She has an extensive research on the phenomena of the Maroons in order to write this novel. So it's an amazing book. It's here available as well. And then her more recent book, of course, which I thought was a lot thicker.
Well,
given the content of the
other one will be
presentation.
thicker. That's an introduction.
But this is just the intro.
This is the intro.
So we look forward to
The larger work.
the larger work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
2 or 3 more years.
And I just want to get another round of applause for our sister Nubia Kai. And I just have to say too, I'm not really objective about appreciating her. We are from Detroit. And from the front line.
Black Detroit.
That's right. And we know our responsibility. That's right.
Detroit Red.
And we also want to thank Keith Gerard Hunter, because if you haven't noticed, he's also written a piece on the back of this book. And I just came. Did you speak already? Did you say something about the book? Could you tell us why you wrote this?
Thank you, Shirley, very much. I've known Nubia for maybe a decade now, maybe a little bit more, and I was always impressed by her. I first realized just how brilliant she was on a cruise with the ancestors with their Nana Kwabena and Tilma Vinyame. That got to be 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah,
and
2007.
2007. So we've been in touch for a long time, and she's always shared some of her research with me. So she had shared the book with me maybe about this essay maybe about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and then as it started to come around, she asked if I'd write a little something for it. So I thought I would. I appreciate you asking me for it. Thank you very much. And also, there's a very famous theater company in New York City, run by Woody King, the New Federal Theater. If you don't know about him, he's a giant. And when I mentioned that I know Nubia, he said Nubia is bad, because she had written a couple of plays that were shown at the Federal Theater years ago. So she's a dramaturg, and she's a playwright, and she's a historian, and just a special person, novelist. And the novel is actually excellent also. So I encourage you all to get that. Please support me.
Thank you. Thank you, Joara. And thank you again, Nubia. I mean, having you a part of Washington, D.C. is a real pleasure. I think Detroit, we stole you from Detroit, but it's our game.
Well, you left us. You left us. She's the one who wanted me to get an African name. It's like she used to be on the radio. She was a newscaster on the radio, a teenager. Wow. Yeah, she was a teenager doing newscasts. Shariki Anaina. I said, wow, what a beautiful name. I gotta get me an African name.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's how it happened.
No, she's everything.
I didn't know how that happened. Okay, good. I'm glad I did some good somewhere.
Yeah, definitely.
I have a question also before we wrap up, and it has to do with Alhambra. I don't know if I visited there a few years ago, and I was just amazed at how it's in the mountains. This temple that had changed hands. You had a picture of it here.
Okay, this is where again?
Alhambra in Spain.
Oh, okay. So you saw. Okay.
And so you can tell how it's been changed from the hands of from Muslims to Christianity, just in the architecture. And you can see the overlay of influence in the architecture. And then when you come back down the mountain, my daughter and I got stuck up there at night, so we had to kind of walk down, which was fascinating because you see all of these holes in the mountain that are actually homes. So you can go into a mountainside going down the road in this mountain, and you pass a dugout space that's tiled in. And it may have a tile seating, it has a door, but it's really a home in a mountain, and they're very small. There are one or two holes that were turned into restaurants, to sort of modernize them, but they were clearly old. And we couldn't get a tour guide or anybody else, historian, to explain the origin of those. I know there was some rumors that they were also, that when the Moors were finally kicked out and that property taken over by Christians during the Crusades, that the Moors hid and buried their wares and riches in various places. Now, this doesn't look like that kind of home. It looked like the kind of place that was actually a hiding place, perhaps. But I thought that was fascinating anyway.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So I would like to open this up to signing. Please get your copy and 3 more copies for people that you care about and you want to make sure they learn about the constructing a sacred history of African Americans, which is an amazing, amazing idea, a river of prophecy. It makes you, it puts in mind of Vincent Harding's work about the continuous river. There is a river by Vincent Harding, and that art is just beautiful.
Yeah, that's Alma Cook.
This is Alma's art? We don't got AI. No, you do. We got a little AI. The creation of more filmmakers. But yes, and so those, you want to sign here? Is this a good place to sign? Yeah. Okay. And just also a little homework. We are forming a Friends of Sankofa or group. We had a town meeting or a meeting where people who wanted to be supportive of Sankofa came and said, yes, we would. Some of you were there. If any other people would like to become a part of that group, to just sort of be in the ecosystem that says, yes, we recognize Sankofa and we want to be around to help be the eyes and ears of Sankofa, to help to market and help support if there are financial needs for Sankofa, to raise money for Sankofa, because we know the political environment that we are trying to survive in. It won't be our first challenge. We've been through many challenges in the last almost 30 years, and we just want to make sure that we organize in advance, that we know that we don't have to start from scratch if anything does happen to this institution. So if you would like to be a part of that, we have a sheet that can be passed around. I think that Maritu is preparing it now. And it just asks for your name and contact information and something that you can do. If you're a good real estate person, or if you know people who are great real estate person, if you know people who are donors and would like to contribute to our expansion or to any of the programming that we do here. If you know somebody who is a good strategist and can consult, on strategies. We're also in the process of becoming a co-op. We will be a worker community co-op soon, and founder co-op soon. So all those things are very exciting about what's going on down the road. So please stay in touch. I'm sure you're already on the newsletter list, but being a part of the Friends of Sankofa is another level of participation that we'd appreciate. So thank you, Sister Nubia. So the line can start here once you bring your book up from the counter.
It's a line for books.
It's wonderful. Yeah, I got that. It's a long thing. I know. You gotta make a song. I know you're still going. But I still want that.
Stay up there. Should have got up there, got to stay